I have a stab too.
All right. We're recording in three, two, and one.
The Babylon Project was our last best hope for peace. It failed, but in the year of the Shadow War, it became something greater. Our last best hope for victory. The year is 2260. The place, Babylon 5.
All right, welcome to episode 110 of Nerdery and Murdery. I'm back, baby.
He's back, baby. Big 110.
Big 110. Had some big life changes, moved over 500 miles away, and that took up a lot of time. So had to take a little bit of time away, and I apologize for that, but I am back.
Hey, there he is. So, move went okay. You're okay with the weather down there, and
Yeah, it's hot, you know.
we actually got some relief up here this weekend. So, for the first time in months.
The hurricane brought us a little bit of rain, but not much relief. It's like 80-90% humidity every day.
Oh,
So
that's not good.
yeah, being near the Gulf Coast, we get a lot of humidity, so it's wet and sticky all the time.
Wet and sticky.
So, but I'm back. I appreciate Zig carrying on with the nerdery while I was gone, and K3 for helping out as well. Some good stuff.
Okay.
Uh, helped me helped me on my long trip during the move, listening to all of those. So it was a lot of fun. So I'm glad to be back and happy to be here. And Zig, with that, I will let you take over on the nerdery side of the house.
Sweet. So I saved this episode for 110 because there were 110 episodes of Babylon 5 because
Sweet.
yeah, that's the kind of geek I am. So, for those who don't know, Babylon 5 is an American space opera television series created by writer and producer J. Michael Straczynski, who we've spoken about before, under the Babylonian production label, in association with Straczynski's Synthetic Worlds Limited and Warner Brothers Domestic Television.
Didn't J. Michael Straczynski do Chuck too? Is that was that him?
That wasn't J. Michael Straczynski, but I do think he wrote on it a little bit.
What am I thinking of else that he's done? Because he's done other stuff.
Since 8 was real big. A few,
Yeah.
um, of course, he's best known for Babylon 5. There's some other stuff he's done as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what else I've seen him on. I'll look it up in a minute.
Right on. He wrote children's shows in the 80s. He's real big in that.
Okay.
Um, in May of 1993, as part of its primetime entertainment network, the show premiered in the U.S. on January 26, 1994, and ran for 5 22-episode seasons. John J. Michael Straczynski wrote all but 4 of them, which is kind of amazing, to think, there's 110 episodes and J. Michael Straczynski wrote 106 of them. The series follows the human military staff and alien diplomats stationed on a space station, Babylon 5, built in the aftermath of several major interspecies wars as a neutral ground for galactic diplomacy and trade. Major plot lines include Babylon 5's embroiled in a millennial cycle conflict between 2 really old alien races, interrace wars and their aftermaths, and interrace intrigue and upheaval. The human characters in particular become pivotal to the resistance against Earth's descent into totalitarianism. Most of the episodes focus on the effects of wider events on individual characters, with episodes containing themes such as personal change, loss, oppression, corruption, and redemption. Unusual in its time, Babylon 5 was conceived as a novel for television with a pre-planned 5-year story arc. Each episode's envisions as a chapter, whereas contemporary television shows tend to maintain, the overall status quo. Like everything is the same at the end as it was at the beginning. Babylon 5 didn't want to do that. And these things affect permanent changes to the series universe. There were also some tie-in novels and some comic books. Straczynski announced plans for a reboot of the series in September of 2021 in conjunction with Warner Brothers Television to air on the CW. In May of 2023, Straczynski announced an animated movie which is unrelated to the planned reboot. The Animated film just came out like last month, I think. um, so yeah, if you like Deep Space Nine, you're gonna like Babylon 5 because they started from the same Bible. Um, it's a slow burn. That first season is quiet,
Yeah.
but there's some hints in it. It's like, oh, what is that about? And it leads to something else. By the time you get into the second season, it really starts going. My only problem with the second season on is the commander or captain, uh, Sheridan. I don't like the character of Sheridan half as much as I like the character of Sinclair. Because the original actor who played him was going through some mental issues, and the grueling schedule of Babylon 5 and the makeup effects that he was having to stare at all day were really kind of playing on his head. So Michael O'Hare decided to bow out after the first season, which is fine because J. Michael Straczynski thought ahead. Every single character has a trap door. So he's got a replacement character for everybody, all the major cast, because he knew he was going to kill some of them off.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, it's a military command structure. When they take one person out, the military command sends somebody in to replace them because that role needs to be filled. So it did happen kind of naturally. My problem is I didn't like the character of Sheridan as much as I liked the character of Sinclair. I don't think Bruce Boxleitner did a bad job. I don't think he was as good as Michael O'Hare, but for what he was given, yeah, he did fine. And he was kind of the face of the franchise for a long time. But yeah, so Michael O'Hare left, and he didn't want to talk about it until after his death. He told J. Michael Straczynski. J. Michael Straczynski knew why he was leaving. He was the only one. And J. Michael Straczynski said, "Look, I will take this to my grave." And Michael O'Hare said, "No, don't take it to my grave. It might help people out if they know why." So after Michael O'Hare passed away, J. Michael Straczynski goes, "This is the reason why he left. He told me I should say this if if he ever had an untimely death, and he did." Yeah. But yeah, can you imagine having what is ostensibly schizophrenia and having to look at alien masks all day,
Sure.
16 hours a week or 16 hours a day?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd mess you up. So
Sure.
I understand it. So I've got a lot of notes, but I basically just want to talk from the heart from Babylon 5 because I love it. I still watch it.
Yeah, I knew this is one of your favorite shows. I've never watched it.
Oh my God, it's beautiful. It's brilliant. Again, first season, slow burn.
Yeah.
So basically, the Earth, we're sending out ships into interstellar space, but we're basically sending out sleeper ships. And then we run across this group called the Centauri, who outward appearance look like us. And the Centauri are like, "Oh, hey, you guys may be one of our lost colonies, blah, 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 blah." It's not true. They're completely anatomically different from us. They just look like us outwardly. Except for their reproductive organs are completely different.
Like Vulcans, like Vulcans.
Yeah, they actually show Centauri reproductive organs later on. That's how different they are. Nobody bats an eye. The men's reproductive organ, because you can't really call it a penis because it's not, basically lays across their chest, and it's got tentacles that come out of it that wrap around the female's back.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Yeah, when they're working on one of the characters had a heart attack, basically. And when they're working on his chest, they open his chest up. It's like, oh, hey, look, they showed his wing. And it's a little prosthetic. It's kind of cool. But yeah, they're completely different. We discover gate technology, which allows us to um, basically use hyperspace. It's all hyperspace based. Um, and then we help a group of other people out against this one group called the Dilgar, who are basically trying to take everybody over. We help them out, and so humanity becomes this large presence in the galaxy, even though it happened relatively fast, like within 30 years. And then a scout ship meets the Minbari. The scout ship, when the Minbari show up, they open their gun ports as a sign of respect. Um, the scout ship did not understand this, and they fired on them. They killed the Minbari's leadership, Dukat, who basically ran their society, and he was well loved. And when he died, they went nuts and went to war with the Earth. And they, because they're about 1,000 years ahead of us, they whipped us at every single turn. They got all the way to Earth, and when they were outside of Earth, about to destroy the planet and erase humanity from existence, they surrendered. Then they helped us rebuild our stuff, and they got together with humanity and realized that we should make a neutral place for everyone to meet to air out their differences, like a UN. Mm-hmm. So they picked a place in neutral space and started building these Babylon systems. The first one got destroyed while it was being built. The second one was sabotaged. The third one was sabotaged. The fourth one disappeared 2 days after it came online. And the fifth one is Babylon 5. Took them about 10 years. And Babylon 5 is the setting of the place. You come to find out later on in the series that the reason the Minbari surrendered is they pulled Sinclair out of a fighter basically to interrogate him, and discovered that Minbari souls and human souls are the same. And that freaked the Minbari out because they don't harm each other. So turns out that's not exactly true, but you find out later on because the Minbari are also embroiled in this shadow war. So there's these two really old groups of aliens who are supposed to keep an eye on the younger races, because there was a large group in the galaxy before that, and everybody else left and went to the rim except for these two groups. And one decided that the best way to help society advance was chaos, so causing a war every few thousand years. And the other group, that's the Shadows, and the other group, the Vorlons, thought everything needed to be about order and rigidness and following the rules. So you find out that every 1 to 10,000 years, they decided to have them a little war between their factions to see who's right. When the younger races finally figure it out, that's actually what's going on. That it's not about conquest, it's about proving a point. They all quit. They're like, you guys, we're done. We're not fighting your war anymore. You guys go to the rim. And they do. But because they use the other races as proxies, there's a bunch of stuff that's still going on. You find out that telepaths exist in the human race. About 100 years before the start of Babylon 5, which is 2260, telepaths started showing up on Earth. Telepaths exist in every single race in the galaxy except for one, the Narn, and that's because the Narn almost got wiped out by the Centauri about 200 years before the events of Babylon 5. It's not that they don't have the genes; they don't have enough people to produce telepaths again. They still have the gene. The Vorlons put that gene in everybody's population secretly 400 or 500 years ago as a defense against the Shadows, because the Shadows use a technology that requires someone being plugged into one of their ships as a control mechanism, and the telepaths disrupt that. So it was purely defensive motive. But you don't know that. So, and the telepaths on Earth, they're run by a shadowy organization called Psychor. And Psychor, if you have telepathic abilities, Psychor basically makes you go live with them. Like they test children. You don't get to live like a regular person. You have to become Psychor. The Corps' mother, the Corps' father. That's what they always say. There are some people who don't want to. So your choices are: you can either join Psychor if you have telepathic abilities. You can take this drug, which gives you major depression, and they come and give it to you every month. Or you can run and become a fugitive. Those are your three options. You can't enlist in the military. You're not allowed to gamble. You're not allowed to. It's messed up. But the Psychor also helps people out in business. You hire a telepath, a low-level telepath, to sit in on your business meetings, and basically they're just there to see if someone's telling the truth or not. So it's messed up. So Straczynski, he was a fan of sagas such as Foundation, Childhood's End, The Lord of the Rings, and Dune, and the Legion, like that. So he wanted a nice long series because he always thought it was a great idea. Of course, he worked on a bunch of television series, most notably Captain Power, and they were really, really working pretty hard on that show, and it got canceled before they could really kind of bring some of their ideas to fruition, and left it on a cliffhanger. So he wanted to write this as a story arc, and that was the idea. He wrote all this stuff up in this Bible, basically, and he shopped it around to everybody, and eventually PTN took it over, Primetime Entertainment Network, which was a distribution arm of Warner Brothers Television. They also did Xena and Hercules, and they brought back Knight Rider, and they did Vanishing Sun, which was a really good series. Yeah, they were on a local station here, and they would just run these either these shows or these movies at night. Kung Fu: The Legend Continues, Time Tracks. These are all done by PTN. But eventually, PTN lost all its shows except for Babylon 5, and it folded. So Babylon 5 was in danger of being canceled in season 4, or at the end of season 4. So they tried to wrap up all their storylines in the 4th season, which is why season 4 seems so frenetic and rushed. Well, TNT gave them a last season and let them do a couple of movies to kind of. Oh, so the last season, the 5th season, seems a little slow compared to the 4th season because they were frenetically trying to get everything done. I think the 5th season is probably the weakest, but there's a lot more political intrigue than there is war, if that makes sense. But it is good science fiction. He said that there's no science fiction television show outside of Star Trek that goes more than 3 seasons. Of course, he's considering American television. He's not considering Doctor Who, which went for years and years and years.
Sure.
But some of the writers that he did bring on, Peter David, Neil Gaiman, Catherine Drennan, Lawrence D. Totillo, DC Fontana, David Gerald, and Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison was basically the science fiction expert. Mm-hmm. You know how they have a person on staff to basically look over everything. And Harlan Ellison was with the show for the whole series. Straczynski stated as a writer, doing a long-term story, it's dangerous and short-sighted of me to construct the story without trapdoors for every single character, which he used. He used it to facilitate the departure of Claudia Christensen and Andrea Thompson from the series. Um, he did recall that Peter Jurassic, who plays one of the ambassadors, the Centauri ambassador, Londo Mollari, asked him about the context of Londo's premonition, shown partially in Midnight on the Firing Line, of himself and Jakar choking each other to death, but Straczynski had to be coy about it. The full death scene was shown in context in War Without End Part 2 near the end of the third season. So he would give these nuggets. Like this one guy had a premonition that he and this other guy would basically be choking each other to death. Which at the beginning, those two characters, the Narn ambassador and the Centauri ambassador, Londo Mollari, played by Peter Jurassic, and Jakar, Citizen Jakar, played by Andreas Katsoulis, were at odds at the beginning because the Centauri had basically enslaved the Narn race 200 years before, and the Narn spent 150 years kicking them off. And they'd spent the last 50 years trying to build themselves up. In the story arc of the series, the Centauri, with the help of the Shadows, reinvade Narn and commit acts of genocide. And you have to deal with that because Londo Mollari is a sympathetic character. Jakar is not at the beginning of the series. Those two people trade places in the second and third season. It's because of the Shadows fooling with stuff. The Shadows are the reason the Narn don't have the Shadows and the Centauri are the reason the Narns don't have telepaths, because 1,000 years ago, one of the Narns, Jaquan, wrote down all the information about the Shadows, or at least as much as he could understand it, in a book. So the Shadows had to get rid of their telepaths. And they basically succeeded. But yeah, I mean, okay, so here's the cast. We'll talk about that. You had Michael O'Hare. He was commander and later ambassador, Geoffrey Sinclair. He does come back for a couple of episodes to kind of tie up loose ends. You had Bruce Boxleitner, who played Captain Sheridan from season 2 to 5. Claudia Christensen as Lieutenant Commander, and then Commander Susan Ivanova. Jerry Doyle is Michael Garibaldi, the head of security. You had Miriam Furlan as Delin, the Minbari ambassador. Richard Biggs was Dr. Stephen Franklin. Andrea Thompson and Talia Winters were the Psychor telepaths assigned, for businesses. Stephen First as Veer Cotto. Stephen First was a Flounder in Animal House.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Billy Mummy played Lanier. Billy Mummy from Lost in Space. Tracy Scoggins came on and played Captain Elizabeth Lockley in season 5. Jason Carter played Marcus Cole. He was season 3 and 4. Caitlin Brown, Mary Kay Adams, and both played Natoth, as diplomatic aide to the Narn ambassador. Robert Russler was Warren Keffer. He was a lieutenant commander, or a lieutenant, and led one of the fighter wings. He was a main character in season 2 just so they could kill him off. Jeff Conaway as Zach Allen, who was in.
Is that the Jeff Conaway from Grease?
Jeff Conaway from Grease, yes. He played this character, Zach Allen, who was in security, eventually becomes head of security. Patricia Tallman is Lita Alexander. She's also a telepath. Andreas Katsoulis is Jakar. Peter Jurassic as Londo Mollari. Wayne Alexander as Lorian, and about 50 other aliens. Wayne Alexander was on the show almost as much as the main cast. But you never could tell because he always had makeup on. Ardwin Chamberlain was the voice of the Vorlon. Tim Choate as Zathras. He was a big character. Robert Atkin Downs as Byron. He was really big in the 5th season. Robert Foxworth was General Haig. Just, Melissa Gilbert played Anna Sheridan. But yeah, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. is William Edgars. He was in there a lot. Ed Wasser is Morden. Mr. Morden was a human working for the Shadows. And there is a great exchange between him and Veer Kodo, Flounder. His whole thing with the Shadows, their question is, what do you want? And the Vorlon's question is, who are you? And when they finally come up with Lorien, who is actually older than the both of those two races, Lorien's like, you don't ask one question or the other, you ask both questions, which kind of settled the argument. But the exchange between Morden and Veer is, Morden asks, what do you want? And Veer says, I'd like to live just long enough to be there when they cut off your head, stick it on a pike as a warning to the next 10 generations that some favors come with too high a price.
Wow.
I want to look into your lifeless eyes and wave like this.
Wow.
In season 3, okay, so that he lays that out in like season 1 or 2. It's season 4. In season 4, Londa's like, Veer, I have a surprise for you. Go outside. He goes out in the garden, and Londa's like, look up. And he looks up, and it's Morden's head. And he goes,
For those of you who can't see anything, he's waving.
He looks up and waves like that. It's awesome. And they laid that groundwork 2 years before they actually showed it.
Mm-hmm. Well.
And of course, later on, they they had a second series called Crusade, where they take a Minbari and human technologies and combine them to make basically a heavy cruiser. And one of the Shadow factions poisons the Earth. So they're looking for a way to save the Earth, plus deal with the Shadow War, or the telepath war coming and everything else. It's a lot. But they only got one season with that because TNT liked the last season of Babylon 5. They did not like the season of Crusade, so they kept jacking with it. And J. Michael Straczynski was like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. So they canceled the series, but it's still pretty good. So each season is basically like a novel. So it's like a 5-book series in a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Season 1 is Signs and Portents. Season 2 is The Coming of the Shadows. Season 3 is Point of No Return. Season 4 is No Surrender, No Retreat. And Season 5 is The Wheel of Fire. And they play out like small novels, with each episode being a chapter. So if you like science fiction novels, you should watch Babylon 5. But it's like any other science fiction novel. That first book, or the first 4 or 5 chapters in that book, is a setup. And they basically spend the first season setting the whole rest of it up. You still get some action. There's still some weird stuff going on. But it descends into Earth descends into authoritarianism in the series, and then they have to bring it back. There's a presidential election, and the president who's in power wins. But as he's going to tour Babylon 5, his ship blows up, and the vice president becomes president, and he starts an authoritarian regime. You find out later on that he blew the ship up. He fully intended. He was working with the Shadows and Psy-Corps to kind of bring those people to the forefront. And it gets bad. I mean, they show this news reporter get taken off the air during a broadcast, and she doesn't come back for a whole season. And when she comes back, she's like, okay, we're back. And homegirl breaks down, starts crying. It's rough. It's really, really rough, but it's really, really beautiful and rewarding. And the amount of work they were able to get done with CGI, because that's all they use. They have no models. Babylon 5 is all CGI. So the first season, the special effects are not great. They're good, but they're not great. By the 5th season, that stuff looks pretty realistic. They used a lot of stuff with Optic Nerve Studios. which is Glenn Hetrick, who was on um, Face Off for what 10 seasons.
Face Off.
Yeah, it was a reality show that ran on science sci-fi
Oh yeah.
makeup. Yeah, the one guy who always wore the goth. Yeah, he ran Glenn Hetrick. He ran Optic Nerve Studios. Well, actually, when he first started, he didn't. During Babylon 5, he didn't run it. He was just working there. But he eventually came to run it. But they did a lot of the face makeup. In the pilot episode, they got a lot of stuff done by Jim Henson Studios, but they weren't really happy with it. So Jim Henson Studios struck up a deal and did Farscape instead. And then they went with Optic Nerve. So in the pilot, some of the aliens look a lot different than they do later on. Which is fine. You don't actually have to watch the pilot. I like it, but the emphasis is different. Like the doctor and the commanding officer, or the XO are two different people. The XO is Tamilyn Tamita from Karate Kid 2. And then they replace her with Claudia Christensen. But yeah, I could go down to about 4 or 5 different rabbit holes, but I don't want to. I don't want to break our audience. I've been keeping these pretty short. So that is basically it for Babylon 5. Well, not really it, but there's a whole bunch more.
Sure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I've known you've loved this show for a very long time. I've never sat down to watch it, and maybe it's time I do. I'm finishing up a show right now, and maybe I'll dive into that.
Right on. Yeah, you should check it out. Like I said, be prepared. That first season is going to be a slow burn. But you'll fall in love with Sinclair and Peter Jurassic as Londo Malari.
Mm-hmm.
The Centauri are great. And Billy Mummy, it's hard. It's hard to spot him because he's in so much makeup. But it's like, where's Billy Mummy? Is it Lanier? Billy Mummy is Lanier? I didn't realize Billy Mummy was that short. He is.
Awesome. Well, go out and give it a watch after listening to Zig talk about it. It sounds like a great show. I think it's something I need to put on my list.
Right on. Thanks, sir.
So with that, after all this long hiatus, we're back to the murdery side of the house.
Murder.
For today, I got my information off Culture Map Austin, Criminal Minds Wiki, Texas Monthly, American Killers, and Servant Girl Murders. And this is the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator.
The Servant Girl Annihilator.
Yes. So most people remember, or maybe they don't, but they consider the University of Texas tower shootings on August 1st, 1966 as the day that Austin lost its collective innocence and entered the history books for infamous reasons. However, it was really a series of horrifying events in the late 1880s, better known as the Servant Girl Annihilator or Servant Girl Murders, that left local citizens paralyzed with fear. The Servant Girl Annihilator, also known as the Austin Axe Murderer, is a still unidentified ephibophilic, I don't know if I pronounced that right, and hemophilic serial killer and serial rapist who was active in Austin, Texas from December 1884 to December 1884 to December 1885. An ephibophile is a person who's primarily attracted to mid to late or post adolescents or boys and girls who have gone through puberty and have advanced signs of adult sexual maturation. Additionally, this means teenagers between 15 and 19 years old, although it may depend on the teenager's puberty status. And a hemophile is a person who's primarily attracted to adolescents or children who have at least started puberty and have signs of sexual maturation, but are still young and developing both mentally and physically. This generally means young adolescents and preteens between 10 and 14 years old. And the term in classifications has sometimes overlap or even confusion with the term ephibophile. Only a few official...
10 to 14 and then 15 to 19.
Correct.
I'm with you.
Only a few official records pertaining to the crimes have survived. However, the information that is available strongly correlates to traits associated with a disorganized anger retaliatory DAR serial killer profile, and the crime scenes of the servant girl murders correspond exactly to that kind of anger retaliatory crime scenes. In the anger retaliatory rape murder, the rape is planned and the initial murder involves overkill. It's an anger venting act that expresses symbolic revenge on a female victim. Nettled by poor relationships with women, the aggressor distills his anguish and contempt into explosive revenge on the victim, and the aggressive killer will either direct his anger at that woman or redirect his anger to a substitute woman. Because the latter type of scapegoating retaliation does not eliminate the direct source of hate, it is likely it will be episodic and repeated to relieve internal stresses. Dynamically, the rape homicide is committed even in a stylized violent burst attack for purposes of retaliation, getting even, and revenge on women. The perpetrator tends to choose victims from familiar areas and may use weapons of opportunity in percussive assaults with fists, blunt objects, or a knife, and the subject tends to leave a disorganized crime scene, and the improvised murder weapon may be found within 15 feet of the body. The brutal killings in Austin occurred 3 years before Jack the Ripper terrorized London's East End, and there are some who believe that the servant girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person.
Huh.
And although these murders happened 75 years before the term serial killer was coined, it still sealed Austin's reputation as the first city in America to have a serial killer, and the person responsible known as the first serial murderer in the country. Over the course of a year, 7 female residents, along with the boyfriend of one of the victims, were attacked with knives, axes, bricks, or iron rods, and police were baffled. They took bloodhounds to the scene of each murder, but dogs could find no trails. Private detectives were hired to conduct their own investigations, but they too failed to find any leads. Because the first victims were black, Austin's white residents initially believed what was taking place was a, quote, Negro problem. Some city leaders theorized that a gang of depraved black men was committing the crimes, going after black women for reasons of its own. To imagine the mind of the authorities at the time, you have to understand the heightened state of fear and suspicion that was present in Austin at the beginning of 1886. In the months since the last murders in December of 1885, the city's police force had tripled in size. A curfew had been enacted, and private citizens had organized into patrols to guard the neighborhoods after dark. Strangers were forced to identify themselves or be evicted from the city. Saloons and other downtown establishments, usually open 24 hours a day, were forced to close at midnight, and a new era of law and order had begun. The first victim was Molly Smith. She was a 25-year-old cook working for the Walter Hall residence on 6th Street, then named Pecan Street. She was killed on December 30th, 1884, in a grisly murder filled with copious amounts of blood due to axe wounds to her head, abdomen, chest, legs, and arms.
Good God.
Her body was found outside and placed in the snow next to the family outhouse, and her boyfriend was also left severely injured from the attack.
Well, it's been a while since Austin got any snow.
Yeah. The following day, the prominent Austin newspaper, Austin Statesman, ran the following headline, "A Fearful Midnight Murder." The next victim was Eliza Shelley, a young woman who worked as a cook for the family of Dr. Lucian Johnson. Killed only a few months after Molly Smith, Shelley had been brutally murdered on Cypress Street on May 7th, 1885, and her head left almost completely split from the blows of an axe. Because of the killer's apparent choice of weapon and axe, the murders were first known as the Austin Axe Murders, until well-known resident William Sidney Porter wrote in a letter to a friend, quote, "Town is fearfully dull except for the frequent raids of the servant girl annihilators who make things lively during the dead of the night." After this letter became public, locals and reporters began referring to the murders of the servant girl annihilator. On May 23rd, 1885, a third woman, also a young servant, became the next victim. Her name was Irene Cross, and she lived on East Linden Street, just across from Shoals Garden. Irene was attacked by a man with a knife, being stabbed multiple times and left to bleed to death. A reporter on the scene after her vicious attack stated she looked as she had been scalped. Summer passed, and with August's arrival came a ghastly attack on Clara Dick. Clara Dick was found severely injured, but she survived the attack. Police investigators were baffled. They had no evidence, no leads, no witnesses, and no suspects. The people of Austin became aware that the serial killer was roaming the streets of their city, and police were powerless to catch the killer in a growing city of 23,000.
23,000 people.
Yeah.
Well, and for our listeners, if you're familiar with the South by Southwest thing, that happens every year down in Austin, this is all happening where that happens, by the way.
Yep. The only plausible explanation that law enforcement could give to the wary public was that an influx of workers to the area by train or wagon had brought a sadistic maniac to their town. They again released bloodhounds in the area around the killings, but had no results. They arrested and questioned possible suspects, but all were released due to lack of evidence. To investigators, the situation was bleak, and then the killing stopped. Citizens fell back into a sense of security, convinced, much like modern-day profilers, that the killer had been caught in the commission of another crime, or that he or she had moved out of the area for fear of being captured. That was the general mindset of the populace until the night of August 31st, 1885, when the killer struck again. A servant named Rebecca Ramey was wounded, and her 11-year-old daughter Mary was killed. Rebecca and her daughter Mary would be the fourth and fifth victims of the axe-wielding murderer. On the night of August 31st, Ramey reported that she was struck in the head with an unidentified object while she slept. She awoke to discover that her daughter was missing from the quarters in which they lived behind the home of a livery stable owned by Valentine Weed. Mary Ramsey's body was discovered in a nearby alleyway. She'd been raped and both of her ears punctured by a sharp object, and once again, bloodhounds were dispatched from the location with little or no sound results.
Good God.
At this time, Austin citizens were seized with fear and began protecting their homes with extra safeguards. Other cautions, such as increased patrols in the neighborhood, going home before sunset, and the 24-hour saloons closing at midnight, were also taken again. It is worth noting that despite the legend, Austin's famous moon towers were not constructed during this time. They came later in the 1890s. On September 1885, a man attacked Gracie Vance, Orange, Washington, and their friends Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson. They were sleeping in a shack behind the home of Vance's boss when the couple was brutally attacked with an axe. Lucinda and Patsy survived the attack, but were left severely injured, while Gracie and Orange died. According to the local paper, Vance's, quote, head almost beaten into a jelly. Despite the name, up to this point, all the victims were African American, but they were not all servant girls, and many noted that white Austinites had not been attacked yet. The final two murders occurred on Christmas Eve, 1885. First, Sue Hancock, described as one of the most refined ladies in Austin, was found in her backyard, which is now the Four Seasons Austin, by her husband. Hours later, Eula Phillips, quote, one of the prettiest women in Austin, was found dead in her in-laws' backyard, where the Austin Central Library is now located. Her husband, Jimmy Phillips, sustained severe wounds in the attack. The crime scenes were so bloody that the population began to ask themselves if multiple individuals or gangs were responsible for the crimes. Ultimately, both spouses of Sue Hancock and Eula Phillips were accused, but found not guilty of the murders. After the Christmas Eve murders of 1885, the killing stopped, but the fear was still palpable. At the time of the murders, Austin had been changing from a small frontier town to a cosmopolitan city, but their reputation it acquired because of the crimes put a halt to the city's growth. Although approximately 400 men were eventually rounded up by authorities and questioned in the killings, all suspects were released and the murders remain unsolved. Bloody axes and sharp objects were often left behind at the scenes, along with bare footprints missing one toe. Several suspects were arrested, but investigators were not able to connect any of them to the murders, which angered the public. Private detectives, again, were also hired to solve the case, but no one was able to identify the killings. And again, the killings suddenly stopped after December 1885, when additional police officers and more private investigators were hired. Because of the fact that Susan and Eula were Caucasian women, the city demanded more attention to the case, but despite all the efforts, the killer was never caught and the case went unsolved. The Annihilator's victims, again, were mostly young African-American women who worked as domestic servants, which was a very common job at the time. They were attacked indoors while asleep in their beds, but 5 of them were dragged outside and killed outdoors. The Annihilator did also rape and mutilate all of his victims. 3 of them were left mutilated indoors, while 1 victim was mutilated outdoors. Adding to the brutality of the murder, the killer would insert sharp objects into their ears like he did the little girl. The Annihilator would also attack anyone who was present during the murders, including the victims' friends, boyfriends, and husbands, but sparing children, except for 1, if possible. However, there are a few names from history that stand out as possible murder suspects. Nathan Elgin was a native Austinite and a young African-American domestic servant who knew the streets of his hometown. Elgin, the chief suspect in the crimes, was shot by authorities when he grabbed a woman from a local saloon and dragged her away. The surrounding neighborhood was in an uproar because the drunken raging man had dragged the girl to a nearby house where he could be heard beating and cursing her while she screamed for help. The entire neighborhood had come out into the streets, and the commotion caught the attention of a nearby police officer. Police officer John Bracken arrived on the scene, and the saloon keeper, Dick Rogers, and a neighbor, Clabe Hawkins, went with Bracken to stop the man from beating the girl to death. Rogers and Hawkins went to the house and pulled Elgin away from the girl and into the front yard. And as Rogers and Hawkins grappled with Elgin, Officer Bracken got out the handcuffs, but Elgin would not be subdued. He threw off Rogers and Hawkins and knocked Bracken off his feet. The man turned on them and brandished a knife. As Bracken tried to recover, a shot rang out. Bracken drew his pistol and fired, and the shot brought down the raging Elgin. He died of his wounds the day after being shot, and the murders immediately ceased. And another vital clue, if you remember, were the footprints found at the crime scene.
4 toes on 1 foot, right?
Yep. Because presumably the killer removed his boots for quick entrances and exits, and one distinctive print matched Elgin, who only had 4 toes on his right foot. The next suspect was Maurice, no last name given, who was a Malaysian cook who worked at the Pearl House in downtown Austin. The Pearl House had connections to a majority of the victims of the Annihilator, therefore this theory gained momentum. It said once Maurice left Austin bound from New Orleans and ultimately London, the murders ended. And although the killings by Jack the Ripper were more brutal in nature, many believe that the Austin and London killers were actually the same person, a person who happened to add horrifying methods to his assassinations.
I think it's Maurice.
It didn't say anything about if he was missing a toe, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Eventually, Jack the Ripper's crimes gained international attention, while Austin's axe murder mystery was eclipsed by the infamous murders in London. However, interest in the servant girl Annihilator murders has recently become the subject of a comprehensive book, The Midnight Assassin, by Texas monthly journalist Skip Hollandsworth. Published in 2015, Hollandsworth's book became a New York Times best-selling title. The newfound interest in the servant girl annihilators isn't necessarily surprising, though. Like the Austin of the 1880s, the city is experiencing tremendous growth, bringing with it an uncertain future. After all, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Interestingly, during the attacks, the servant girl annihilator interacted with 2 young boys but did not harm them. The first was 8-year-old Douglas Brown, a nephew of Irene Cross, who declared that a big, chunky Negro man, barefooted and with his pants rolled up, had covered him with a blanket and told him to be quiet. He had no recollection of the murder, and it's speculated that the killer sedated him with chloroform stolen from a dentist's home. And the other child was Eula and James Phillips' 2-year-old son, Thomas Phillips, who was sleeping with his parents and was given an apple by the killer. Many theories regarding the perpetrator of the murders has been proposed by researchers, profilers, and criminologists in the 130 years since the servant girl annihilator rampaged through the streets of Austin. One theory contends that the murders were committed by a killing pair, and it took 2 people to move the victims so quickly and quietly. Another theory proposes that a random drifter, not a citizen of the capital city, had to have murdered the innocent victims. Several researchers have put forward their own perpetrators, but the most interesting of all theories began to emerge 100 years later, as again it has been suggested based on compelling circumstantial evidence that Jack the Ripper used Austin, Texas as a proving ground for murder. The Austin Axe murderer case remains a mystery to this day, and in spite of the vast amounts of evidence, the events of 1884 to 1885 will remain forever so. And that is the story of the servant girl Annihilator.
I have never heard of this before.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, I found this one and found it interesting.
Nice.
Another one from our state.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you betcha. You betcha. Well, thanks for joining me today. I'm glad to be back.
Nice to have you back, sir.
Yeah. Hope everybody enjoyed today and is happy for everything to be back together. As always, as a reminder, you can find more information on the items we talk about on nerderyandmurdery.com. It's our hub where we have pictures, links to everything we talk about, plus additional information. You can also find our merchandise link on our webpage, where if you wish to get your Nerdery and Murdery merchandise, show off your fandom, please do consider to go there. And you can also find the link to our Patreon, where if you wish to become a donator to the show, help with the costs that do occur with this show. It's not free, it's not cheap, but we enjoy doing it. So do please consider being a Patreon.
Thank you.
Or being a patron, excuse me.
Yes.
And then Zig also does put stuff on TikTok and YouTube as well. So do check those out, subscribe to us, and see the things that are going through his mind.
Yes. I have also recently been posting this video on our YouTube page and not posting it until the episode goes out, so you can actually see this video. So
cool.
You can see this.
Awesome. That way people can see what you were doing.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Glad to be back. That's it for this week. So Zig, with that, go ahead.
Zig with your nerdery.
And I've been Geoffrey with your murdery.
Cue the music.